And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, and welcome to this week's edition of the Thursday Talks on DME for Peace. My name is Jack Farrell, and I am the Manager for Partnerships and Strategic Innovation at Search for Common Ground, and I'm going to be your moderator today. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Ayselin Botoyeva, and I know I made a mess of that, Ayselin. I'm so sorry, even though we just practiced it right before we went live. But Ayselin is a research evaluation and learning specialist at Search for Common Ground, and she is going to lead a discussion on handling harmful content online, cross-national perspectives of users affected by conflict. Now, to our audience, just a note, if you have a question during Ayselin's presentation, you can write it in the question or chat function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the discussion. I am done talking for now, so I'm going to hand over to today's guest. Ayselin, you are very welcome to the Thursday Talks. Feel free to take it away when you're ready.
Great. Well, thank you, Jack, for the introduction, and thank you for hosting me here today. As Jack mentioned, I am Ayselin Botoyeva. I'm a research evaluation and learning specialist at Search for Common Ground, based in the DC office. And I'm here today to present the results of the research. This study was led by Search for Common Ground's institutional learning team and the Global Affairs and Partnerships team. So the study really began with this very simple premise. We all know at this point, right, that harmful content, including hate speech, false news, cyberbullying, and inflammatory rumors, they can spread very quickly and reach millions online. While research on the effects of harmful content has grown in the last decades, it is still, however, very rare for researchers and policymakers to engage with actually the end users, especially those who are in conflict settings. There's very little that we know about how the end users in conflict settings use social media, and moreover, what do they do when they are exposed to offensive language, hurtful videos and photographs, and generally anything that can incite harm. And it is understandable why, right, that gap has existed in research and in the existing studies. Not all researchers are interested in the topic, have access, or can overcome language barriers, or can overcome political constraints and mobility limitations. So at Search for Common Ground, we really wanted to leverage the kind of presence that we have in so many countries in the world and use the kind of knowledge that we have gained, right, the institutional knowledge that we have gained on conflict dynamics on the ground. So given that, we went into the study with one of the simple questions, right, that drove the study was, how do individuals and groups living in conflict settings respond to harmful content online? What do they actually do? What types of tactics that they may deploy typically, right? So with that question in mind, we then focused on 3 target groups. And the 3 target groups included, first of all, direct participants in violence. This involved former or current members of youth street gangs or militant and armed groups. So for example, in Kenya, we spoke to former members of Al-Shabaab and really, again, leveraging the kind of access that we have to certain groups that we have established rapport with them, and so they were open to talk to us about these things. Second group, the second group that we've engaged in this study was those who socialize with direct participants. In other words, family members, educators, social workers, and community organizers. In other words, those who have actually worked with some of these people, especially with vulnerable youth groups. And finally, the third group that we engaged in this study included active resistors of violence. In other words, local youth and young professionals, civil society organizers, and journalists, those who have worked in interfaith dialogue and social media literacy initiatives, those, in other words, who have been working on this topic for a number of years and who know what the dynamics are and are constantly watching those kinds of trends in their countries. So in the study, we talked to 68 individuals in total in 7 different countries, as you can see here on the slide. This was 7 different countries across 4 regions. So in the Northern Triangle, we engaged with participants in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. In East Africa, this was Kenya and Tanzania. In Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, and in Southeast Asia, Myanmar. So what is harmful content? Obviously, we went into this study with our own assumptions and understandings of what harmful content includes, but we really wanted to hear from the participants themselves. What their experiences have been like? What do they consider harmful? Who do they have in mind, right? When they talk about harmful content, is it just themselves, or do they actually want to fend their children off, right? Or who do they consider really in their communities, in their families, in their surroundings, right? Vulnerable and susceptible to harmful content. So when we asked this question, we actually got a whole host of different types of answers, right? And we were actually amazed with the kind of detail, sometimes a little too graphic, right? Detail that the respondents would describe different types of content that they have been exposed to. So if we were to categorize, right, different answers that the respondents gave us on what they consider to be harmful content, we came away with 4 different types. The first being the kind of content that really stigmatizes the other, right? So we all know that religion-based or ethnicity or racial and regional divisions and conflicts are not new. What is new, however, is the kind of way in which people started circulating hateful content, right, through social media, inciting violence across all of these dividing lines. So in Myanmar and Kenya, these were the 2 countries where we saw the highest number of reports of hate speech and other calls to incite violence based on religion. Respondents talked about how in Myanmar, for example, Buddhists and Muslims, right, the kinds of slurs that they use, or the kind of content, again, that, sometimes or oftentimes actually fake content, right, videos and photographs that, each side uses to incite and fuel further revenge attacks and further kinds of violence that happens offline. Across Guatemala, Kenya, Myanmar, and Kyrgyzstan, we heard accounts of ethnic and racial-based conflict and the kind of content that really gets circulated, right, and really fuels those kinds of tensions that have existed for a long time. So the second category here is the kind of content that threatens and terrorizes. So respondents from the Northern Triangle and East Africa discussed violence sparked by gangs and extremist groups. Gangs terrorize communities through the means of social media by putting out threats to kidnap all children or kill anyone, right, who goes into a certain neighborhood. Sometimes these messages are coded in cryptic language, and at other times these are very explicit calls, right, for violence. The third category here is the kind of content that normalizes violence and legitimizes targeted attacks. Across all of these contexts, people emphasize that social media has ignited sexual gender-based violence. This includes targeted attacks on women, particularly women in politics, and those who are activists, as well as against members of the LGBTQ community. In Kenya and Honduras, participants reflected on how sextortion has actually become very popular, right, and how it's actually wielded against youth specifically. And finally, the fourth category here is the kind of content how governments, right, have been using social media and deploying it for surveillance purposes. Authoritarian and liberal regimes have been increasingly using social media as a tool for surveillance and discipline and punishment. So for example, many Kenyan participants, from youth leaders to former and current Al-Shabaab members, reflected on a recent incident, for example, in which the Kenyan Defense Forces shared videos of them playing with corpses of Al-Shabaab members, and how that inflamed further revenge attacks, right? And again, there are so many different examples that are examples of harmful content that our participants have shared with us with. And we could go on forever, but these are sort of the four general categories that we came away with after listening to respondents' examples. So, when they encounter that content, right, what do they do? How do they actually, do they do anything actively, or do they try to ignore it, right? So that was really one of the key questions that we were interested in. And the key takeaways here for us is that, first of all, users across all three groups, right, starting from direct participants in violence and then ending with those who are actually active resistors of violence, all users do not want to interact with harmful content. And while that is not surprising, the more interesting finding for us was to reveal a myriad of different ways in which users are actively trying to tackle harmful content, and mostly in ways that actually make them feel in control. And the tactics that make them feel like they actually have the ownership, right, and agency and say in this. And a lot of our respondents obviously talked about the kind of distrust, right, that they have towards the powers that may be, right, when it comes to social media platforms, or when it comes to flagging harmful content, how they really perceive that as kind of a black box, right? They don't know what happens at the other end of it. So that really sort of was one of the common answers that we heard. So the preferred tactics, right, when it comes to handling harmful content among respondents, the preferred tactics really included directly engaging actually with perpetrators of harmful content. This may sometimes involve efforts to engage in a conversation. In other cases, these also turn into methods of fighting it out. So that was actually across different countries. What we heard was sometimes when they see certain people, especially public figures, right, being attacked and harassed online, some people actually reach out to the perpetrators of that harmful content, and sometimes they actually end up, right, coming at the other end of it, having a meaningful conversation with those people, and then in other cases they actually meet offline, right, and have these what they themselves call cases of fighting it out, right? They just kind of want to prove that they can show it to the perpetrators of harmful content, that there are consequences to their actions. So users from all three groups cited also exit strategies as the most common way through which they try to reduce their own and their close ones' exposure to harmful content. And exit strategies include, muting, exiting, right? WhatsApp groups, we all have done it, or unfollowing, friends on Facebook, or basically just kind of exiting. Or sometimes they even, talked about how they deleted certain social media accounts, because they really thought it was sort of, they were getting really tired, right, of being exposed to it, and they didn't see an end to it unless they really exited. So exit strategies, it was clear to us that they offer users a clear and a very concrete way to end their engagement, right, with harmful content. Unlike reporting, for example, flagging and so forth, right, that social media platforms make available, the result with exit strategies is actually guaranteed and as well as immediate, right? They can sort of do it and they know that it's very immediate and it's tangible, as opposed to, again, flagging or using other mechanisms that are made available on social media platforms. For a lot of users, those, just kind of lead to the feeling of, it's a black box process, right? I don't know what's actually going to happen, who is making decisions, who is going to see my reports, and so forth. So it is very much understandable, right, why end users may rely on those exit strategies. However, what these exit strategies do not address is the underlying stress and grievance, of course, right? Those that have chosen to fight it out illustrate the connection between harmful online content and offline harm and violence. So here I have a quote from Azim. This is a pseudonym to keep this respondent confidential and anonymous. So he is a young Uzbek entrepreneur in Osh, Kyrgyzstan, and he talked about this case when he saw an Uzbek blogger, a very well-known and well-regarded person in his community, being harassed, right, by Kyrgyz users online. And so he actually reached out to them and they met and then they had a fight. So we can again see how this sort of reaching out, right, and engaging with perpetrators of harmful content, it can be a double-edged sword, right? Sometimes it leads to meaningful conversations, and in other times it actually incites further violence, right, and physical violence offline. So furthermore, we really see that the deep-seated cultural and political factors make users reluctant to deploy reporting mechanisms that are made available, again, on social media platforms. First of all, our respondents talked about the inability to ensure safety and security when they're online, and if they choose to report, this has become especially of high concern for people in Myanmar, for example, right, where they feel really insecure and unsafe when they're even commenting, right, leaving. They're worried about the kind of tracks that they're leaving and how it can be traced back to them. And in contexts where retribution against those who blow the whistle on others is common, users fear that reporting content will also threaten their physical security, right? This was especially very common in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, where respondents talked about fears of how, if again, they're going to report on someone, although that's very an anonymous mechanism, they fear that their security, right, will be threatened. And these fears are not baseless, of course, and they're deeply rooted in experiences, in past experiences, right, when people actually, they disappeared after certain accusations, right, of what they posted online. And so these sort of deeply rooted experiences, they shape local cultural norms of what it means to quote unquote tell on or report on someone. So the lack of transparency about what follows after they flag or report harmful content really sort of deters them from using those mechanisms. So again, they much rather prefer to use exit strategies or to reach out to these perpetrators of harmful content, or altogether just kind of ignore, right? So what are the lessons learned for digital peace builders then? What can we actually do to make online spaces safer for people, particularly those who already live in conflict settings? And I'd be happy to hear any thoughts that our participants today have, any types of suggestions or examples of what their organizations may have already been doing in this regard. But some of the thoughts that we would like to share today, based again on this study, is that very broadly, multi-stakeholder engagement is a necessity, right? And this multi-stakeholder engagement should be actually involving peace builders and policymakers, right? Not just the tech companies, because in some ways we're actually very well positioned to coordinate and address root causes of the harmful content in addition to the symptoms. So for example, if we take religious divides, right, we are really positioned to be addressing the root causes of religious divides, in addition to the kind of hate speech that actually results based on those types of tensions and conflicts. In doing so, peace builders and policymakers need to also differentiate, however, right, between the intentional malicious use of social media to create harm and the kind of unintentional spread of harmful content that can happen on social media, and apply those responses and strategies accordingly. Finally, we can be co-designing and implementing programs that transform those structural, social, and cultural barriers, right, to positive use of social media. One of which I just brought an example up, right, of how respondents, especially in the Northern Triangle, how they view reporting to be, how they associate it with telling on someone or reporting someone, right, or whistleblowing on someone. So those are obvious examples of sort of the kind of cultural and social barriers that exist, right, for handling harmful content in a way that makes respondents and participants safe. And if we're talking about more specific strategies and tactics, right, that peace builders can be employing, it's first of all, we should be building skills of everyday users to avoid counter messaging, right, and encourage constructive dialogue and alternative messaging. We can create spaces both online and offline to share concerns, risks, and tactics to support individual users in tackling harmful content. And this is, some of these things are already happening in some contexts. I know from my own experience, in Central Asia, for example, some of the organizations such as Internews and so forth, they have been doing they have already been implementing some of these, right? Creating both online and offline sort of spaces for individual and group users in really, first of all, recognizing what is harmful content, right? In a lot of cases, people actually speaking, right, of unintentional spread of harmful content. In a lot of cases, people may not necessarily realize the kind of language and narrative or content that can be hurtful. So they can contribute to that spread unintentionally, right? And if we're speaking of search for common ground specifically, we could be adapting and training, for example, our very well known at this point common ground approach, right, for online spaces, because that has really been one of the methodologies, right, that have proven effective in as a tactic of conflict resolution on the ground. So we could be adapting those effective tactics of conflict resolution to online spaces, right? And particularly when it comes to moderators, that was one of the things that came out of this study. I did not, touch upon it earlier, but our respondents also talked about how moderators of especially private groups, right, closed groups that are not necessarily, again, visible to non-members, how moderators are not necessarily skilled, right, to facilitate those discussions or to, again, fend off hurtful and harmful content from being kind of spread in those spaces. And finally, we can build specific, right, digital literacy and digital security skills to address risks of engaging online. And again, some of these are already happening, but we would love for a lot of these to kind of amplify and to really be used in these spaces more actively. I'll stop there because I know that we're at time for my presentation, but I'm really looking forward for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Iselkin, thank you so much for such a detailed presentation and for all of your work on this report. To our audience, we are now going to open up to your questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question or chat function on your GoToWebinar dashboard. So that will allow you to type your question. The second, and this is the one I'd like to encourage, is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, and that will allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace as well as Connexus. So those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion. Just another note about today's discussion section is we're also joined by Althea Middleton-Detzner, who is a digital peace building advisor at Search for Common Ground as well, to help answer any questions about the platform specifically. I am going to use my moderator's privilege here, Iselkin, and ask you to unpack a little bit more about the examples of how organizations are already responding to hate speech online. Like you give the example of internews. Could you provide a bit more sort of information on ways that organizations are already doing this work?
Yes, certainly. And I think Althea will also be very well positioned to talk about what Search has been doing in that regard. So I'll leave some space for her to respond there. But one of the, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, again, given just my interest in the subject matter, I've been just kind of noticing, right, what is going on. And I think there are quite a few organizations like Internews or like Search for Common Ground who are trying to come up, right, with very creative solutions of how to actually tackle this, right? So I know that our Search for Common Ground's Myanmar team actually has a project where they are working on solutions, right? When it comes to especially rumors and fake news and so forth. Althea will probably know the details more, but I also know that when it comes to other organizations, Internews has been leading that work specifically in Central Asia, sort of tackling and helping, right, end users, but also especially influencers, right? I mean, they work with influencers a lot in sort of really providing them space to educate people on how to even detect harmful content, right? What is harmful content, and really digging deep into what types of language can be hurtful, right? And I think they recognize that there is a need to sort of educate people on that, and then also on the technical side, right, on how to prevent harmful content from spreading even further. But I wonder if Althea wants to come in and provide a little more detail on what's going on Search's side in Myanmar and perhaps other contexts.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aisel. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you for checking. Yeah, so I think this is super interesting, and just to pick up on sort of where you were leaving off there in terms of even understanding what online harms are, I think that this is a new space for peace builders in terms of looking at analyzing, understanding what online harms are. And, I just commend this research because part of the challenge with designing interventions or programming activities to address online harms is understanding it. And every time that I revisit this research, I am sort of like learning something new, or something new is kind of popping out. And one of the things I was reflecting on during your presentation is that so often I think actually in creating strategies and tactics for addressing online harms, we are thinking in terms of categories of harms like hate speech or mis and disinformation or violent extremism recruitment. And what I think is really interesting about this research is that by approaching it the way that you all did, it was able to surface harms from within the context as opposed to applying kind of these frameworks to the problem. So I just think that that's really interesting, and that the research itself then has insights into how to design interventions based on those contextual nuances of how harms are showing up in that context. So that's one way of looking at it, is contextualizing, well, what are the harms in this context, and then designing around those specific issues. As far as some of the programming that we're doing at Search for Common Ground, we are investing quite a bit right now in understanding the online environment through social media listening. Monitoring itself can be an activity in and of itself in terms of monitoring hate speech or monitoring violent extremist narratives or mis and disinformation. And I think, there are some sort of obvious interventions that are out there in the peace building field right now, of which media literacy is coming up quite a bit, digital security training is as well, also media campaigns that use messaging, alternative messaging or positive peace messaging as a way of shifting narratives once identified. So I think the role of social media listening in our programming right now is both to better understand the online environment, but also to utilize some of the insights from those narratives, to actually design messaging and design campaigns that address those narratives. That's one approach. Another approach is, as you were referring to, actually learning from the online space, but actually carrying out activities that might be on the ground. So there's examples of programming that we've done where the online space has been used to recruit people to attend concerts and music events, where at those concerts and music events we might be bringing together groups that, you know, into a space that is facilitating sort of a social cohesion outcome, or collaborating on the development of murals and other artistic sort of expression that's actually in offline spaces. So using the online space to either bring people together or inform them and to come together into offline spaces, and vice versa as well. There was a lot of offline organizing in order to also join events online where groups might come together that are like geographically dispersed. So I think just thinking about programming interventions based on online harms being both online campaigns and messaging opportunities as well as offline activities. And maybe I'll just pause there and send it back to the group.
Thanks, Althea, and thanks, Iselkin, for such a detailed response. The questions are flying in. The next one comes from Theo Dolan of FHI 360. And Theo writes, "It strikes me there's an imbalance in terms of effective tactics to combat online harms. Many understandably focus on digital media literacy, which is important, but the digital security skills lag far behind. Are there any good approaches, tools, or anything else in that area that you would recommend?"
That's a very good question, and I may actually ask Althea to come back in again in this conversation. And I do agree with that point. And as I mentioned, in Myanmar, for example, right, one of our country teams that is specifically working on this issue, they have been voicing their concerns, right, that they don't feel safe and that it's a matter of security. And what do they do, right, to sort of tackle that? I think Althea has been supporting them in that regard to the extent that she can, although she's not, you know, necessarily. I mean, she works mostly on other aspects, right, of our work when it comes to peace building and social media. But to be very honest, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't come up with a good answer of what the good tactics are on that. I don't know, Althea, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I can absolutely. Yeah, and hi, Theo. Thanks for the question. I think that this is so. The way that I would answer this is that I actually think that the peace building field right now is at is in a position to actually have to take stock of methods that are going to address online harms. And I think that's partially how I was answering earlier, is to think about, you know, what is our toolkit in terms of online response. And I think this research does point to some insights that might actually inspire new methods and new tactics for addressing online harms in online spaces. And then also thinking about the opportunity to use some of our traditional peace building methods that might be in offline spaces to address some of the root causes of the online harm. So I talk a lot about how the speech itself or the content online can often be seen as just a symptom of a root cause. And so backing up and looking at, well, what are the root causes and how do we address those? So I think that's one way of looking at this question. The other way of looking at it is in terms of innovation in the peace building field. And so some of the work that I've done prior to joining the search team was involved in trying to collect methods and tactics. There's no publication from that research, but I do think that there are various working groups that I know you're a part of that are trying to bring together and learn from one another and see, you know, well, how are different organizations innovating in this space in terms of approaches and methods. And one of the challenges that I faced in doing some of that research is just that there are a lot of fields intersecting that are looking at this. So there's a lot of media strategies and sort of media response options and opportunities. There's sort of traditional peace building methods that might look at mediation or negotiation or dialogue. And I think Iselkin was referring to, you know, how do we adapt some of our, you know, dialogue or common ground approaches to online spaces? What might we need to do differently in online spaces to utilize those tools and those methods. But I think that there's also new approaches that that not only utilize some of the digital tools, but also are innovative and new and creative that that people are testing in context, but not necessarily collecting together and publishing in any way. As far as digital security specifically, some of the resources that I would point to are the ones that are put out by Access Now. They have an amazing program that includes both like a hotline where you can call in and get actually tailored support in your digital security context. So they might do like an analysis or an assessment and also provide some recommendations. The other organization that I am a fan of that is a sort of different angle on digital security is Witness. Based in New York, and they do a lot of video for change work, and they've done a lot around both how to keep information safe on your cell phone. They developed apps and different programs that you can use to keep your phone safe, but they also have done a lot about capturing video and how to keep that video footage safe if you are documenting cases of human rights abuses, or if you're in a context where that video footage, maybe it's a protest or something like that, where you want to capture what's actually happening and use it as evidence in the future. So they do a lot around that kind of approach. So, but I would agree that like right now, I think what the peace building field is looking at is a lot of media literacy and digital security programming, because that's sort of what we've had in our cachet for a while. And I think there's a lot of room for growth and innovation right now in this space.
Thank you, Theo, for your question. Thank you, Althea and Iselkin. Our next question has come through from Colonel Pratt. And Colonel, I'm going to unmute you right now because your question is very interesting. I'd love to hear you ask it live. You are self-muted, so if you just want to click on your microphone, you should be good to go.
All right. This is a fascinating discussion. And it reminded me of an article that I read in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was entitled Applying Epidemiological Model to Counter Misinformation. And they advocated for using real-time surveillance, accurate diagnosis, and rapid response to responding to harmful content online, the same way that, organizations like the World Health Organization would respond to infectious diseases. And I think it goes right along with the idea of combining efforts online and on the ground to kind of contain the harmful effects of this kind of content. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on something like that?
Althea, Iselkin, does anybody want to take a crack at that?
That is a very interesting question, actually. I started thinking through all kinds of other studies that I have recently read on that topic. I mean, I think that's an interesting approach, but I'm also wondering how, practitioners may have used it so far, especially, thinking about another concern, right, and another trend recently around, so-called troll factories, right? So that's one of the things that I didn't necessarily touch upon in this presentation, but some of our respondents specifically talked about how increasingly it is becoming so confusing and so they basically talked about, right, how they can't even know who to trust online. Before, if they were in a Facebook, if they joined Facebook and they had an account, they knew that most of their newsfeed was filled with the kind of content shared by their friends and neighbors and maybe colleagues, right, and college friends and so forth. And these days, I mean, people are increasingly, I think, concerned, and rightfully so, about the kinds of, the anonymity, right, that people, some people use, and especially sort of more those kinds of actors that are using it with a malicious intent. And it's specifically around elections as well, right? So I think, some of the tactics that Althea just mentioned, such as monitoring even, right? What are the spikes that happen, for example? What are the kinds of words that get often used that seem to sort of, right, go around and incite the kind of hatred and violence and further attacks, right? I mean, I think those kinds of tactics could perhaps help us to see those trends, but when it comes to the kind of what you just mentioned, the epidemiological approach to tracing, really, from what I understand, it would be a process of tracing, right? Like who is saying and how and so forth. Maybe I'm not understanding it very clearly, but I would not, at this moment at least, know how that could be used, especially, as I said, with with this concern of like troll factories and so forth, right? How they're just multiplying and how they're deployed, especially by political parties, right, around election time and so forth. I don't know if Althea wants to come in here as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understood kind of the surveillance component of it, but I guess I definitely think that if we think about, so I wouldn't look at social media monitoring or social media listening as a form of surveillance simply because it is public information. And I think of it more as sort of like a big data analysis tool as opposed to like a surveillance tool. But I think I'm missing something there. But I definitely think that by monitoring trends online, whether it's looking at hate speech or misinformation narratives, things of this nature, that there are insights from that data that can inform the peace building field, whether it's about doing a conflict analysis or a situational analysis, all the way through to reporting on trends that might be used as like an early warning mechanism, all the way through to designing interventions based on the insights from that analysis. So I think we're looking at different ways of applying that tool across the project cycle. And that, yeah, I think that there's like a tremendous amount of information there. And I would agree with what Aislinn was saying. I think that there's also a need to pause and reflect on some of the risks of various like surveillance mechanisms, as far as I know that there's like a lot of conversation going on right now, for example, in the use of digital capturing of like identity information in Afghanistan with the change of governance there, and sort of the risks involved in sort of what may have been a tool that was used to facilitate participation in elections now being used as a database of information that can be weaponized as well. So I think just understanding those risks and those potential and kind of weighing that in terms of how we as peace builders think about the tools that we want to use in this space. So that's how I would answer for now. And I'd be interested to hear more about the example. I think I missed some of that.
Well, we can. I can share the article with you, Althea, because Colonel's put it in the chat. We have time for one last question. I'm sorry to all members of the audience who've asked questions that we haven't been able to get to. This question comes from Samah Abdul Rahman, and Samah writes, in this report, did you define different gender perspectives in terms of what is actually harmful content, or how did you deal with this?
That's a good question, and thank you, Samah. I mean, again, because the study wasn't necessarily trying to tease out gender differences. I mean, I think it's important, but we did not hone in on that aspect. But we did definitely see how women, right, and LGBTQ members, they were, representatives, right, they were actually talking, right, a lot more in comparison to male participants about some of the examples that I mentioned earlier, right? Sextortion, or some of the, gender and, GBV, gender-based violence, right? And the kind of content that they really think is sometimes even being amplified, right, by well-known public figures, right, where they perhaps sometimes unintentionally, perhaps intentionally in some cases, right? They give voice to the kind of actors who are further kind of perpetrating messages that are normalizing gender-based violence, right? That again targets women, and especially women who, I think I mentioned this earlier as well, women who are in politics, women who are public figures, right? Women who may be speaking up as activists. Of course, they get attacked, right, and harassed and bullied online. But again, I think, it was just very stark for us to see that those examples were coming more often from women and LGBTQ members than male participants. But further than that, yeah, we didn't really hone in on sort of the gender differences.
Great, thank you, Isaac, and thank you for a wonderful presentation and discussion today. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your research with us, and thank you, Althea, for adding your expertise to the discussion. To our audience, you're always superstars, and that's why I'm letting you in on a little secret. There's an after party to today's webinar. Yes, we have after parties after our webinar. So I know some of you didn't get a chance to ask your question, but I would love for us to continue this conversation on Connexus. We set up a discussion forum where you can share your insights, ask your questions. We'll try to get a response for you. I'd also be keen to learn, like, what resources do you use around responding to hate speech online? Like, have you seen anything that is particularly useful? Have you seen anything from another sector that the peace building field could learn from? I'd be really curious to see that. So please feel free to go on to Connexus, share your resources, and continue the discussion, ask questions, help us learn together as a field. And if you don't already know, Connexus is DME for Peace's sister platform. We set it up to respond to the coordination and connection challenges we were seeing in the COVID-19 response. And we're broadening the platform out in the coming months to really focus on creating connection opportunities for anybody working in conflict-affected contexts around the world to make sure we're having conflict integrated thinking. It's super quick and easy and free to sign up. So I expect to see all of your names with profiles and commenting on the discussion forum in just a matter of moments, because you can sign up using your Facebook, Google, or LinkedIn account, or you can just fill in the form. So go to Connexus, sign up. You'll be able to find the recording from today's webinar in that discussion forum. You'll be able to access the full report on Connexus as well. So please join us on Connexus. If you're having any issues signing up, feel free to reach out to me. Like I said, the report and everything is posted on Connexus. So join us, join the party. And I think there's some pretty good music happening right now. Okay, now that I'm done with my awful jokes and bad banter, just a last thank you to Iselkin for a great presentation. I know this research was a big piece of work, and it creates some exciting opportunities for further work down the line. And a special thank you to our audience for providing fuel for our discussion. Like I said, this recording is going to be posted on the Connexus discussion forum, as well as DME for Peace's media gallery. So please feel free to return to it, share it with your colleagues, and continue the discussion. To you all, I hope you take care, look after yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you online again soon.